This video is on the axial skeleton, which is composed of some of these bones in red, such as the skull, the vertebral column, which they've not put in red, the rib cage, which they did put in red, and the sternum. So, before we begin, how is the skeleton divided? How would you divide the skeleton? Top and bottom, limbs, and trunk. Sorry, I'm writing this at an angle. How else could you divide it? Front and back, long bones and short bones. There's lots of different ways. What are some of the different bones? Well, we looked at the regions already. What region's this? That's the temporal region. That's a bone. What region's that? Parietal. What region is this right here? That's the frontal region. What region is that? We already did the temporal. This region back here, that would be the sternal, the occipital, I mean. So we've learned some of the bones by the regions. What are some of the features? So we looked at this at the end of last lecture, and all I care about for the first exam is, do you know what these structures are for? Well, let's tilt this bad boy over. And we have pointy things right here. That's a pointy thing. That's a pointy thing. What are pointy things called? Processes. What do? Attach muscles and ligaments. Ooh, we have a big, giant hole right there. Oh, another hole right there. What are holes? Foramen. And they let nerves, in this case it's the spinal cord, go through. Then we have paired round structures right here. Let's try the other skull, which just fell apart on me. So we have paired round structures right there. Those are condyles, and yes, that has got to hurt what just happened to him. And again, I want you just to know what those features are for, not the specific ones for the first exam. Now, the human skeleton. There's roughly 206 bones in an adult. You're actually born with more, and they fuse as we age. And it's divided into half. We have the axial and appendicular skeleton. So what do you think the difference is? The bones of the axial skeleton are found on the central axis right here. So those would be the skull, the vertebral column, the rib cage, and the sternum. Your appendage is added on. So the appendicular skeleton would be your limb bones, so your arms, your legs, and actually your scapula is considered part of the appendicular skeleton. Your hip bones, right there, are considered part of your appendicular skeleton as well. On the test, I'm going to ask you, which of the following bones is part of the axial skeleton, which is part of the appendicular skeleton, and which is not part of the appendicular or axial skeleton. So, the axial skeleton, that's all these bones. I guess that's green. So we have the cranium, which is actually divided into... So what is the axial skeleton? Well, the axial skeleton is made up of your skull right here, which is actually divided into your cranial bones. Remember, those are bones that touch the brain, and your facial bones, which do not. Your vertebral column. Let's move that out of the way. The sternum and the ribs. So the skull, the cranial bones, the facial bones, the vertebral column, the rib cage, and then these other couple bones. The hyoid bone, that's in your neck about right there. It's right above your Adam's or Eve's apple. And then you have these three little itty-bitty baby bones in your ear called ossicles, and those are in a completely different chapter. Your appendicular skeleton are your appendages. They are attached. Now, that would be your arms, your legs, but notice the scapula and the clavicle are highlighted here. That is part of your appendicular skeleton. They hold the arms on. They're called girdles. So they're considered part of your limbs, not part of your axis. Same thing for your hips. Your hip bones are attaching your legs to your central axis, so they're considered appendicular. Now, I've given you like these numbers for bones about how many are in. I do not care that there are 206 bones allegedly in the body. There's 126 appendicular bones and so forth. I will care about paired versus unpaired, how many vertebrae, but total number of bones, I'm not a big fan of because they fuse, some of them don't fuse. I used to know a person who was very excited that their sacrum was not fused when they got an x-ray of their lower back. So we're not going to worry about the total number of bones. So this is how I'm going to test you on this. I'm going to ask you which bones would not be in the appendicular skeleton, or which ones would not be in the axial skeleton. This question, which bone would not be in the axial skeleton? So, these are all regions we've learned. Frontal, that's right here. That's definitely in the axial skeleton. Sacrum, where is your sacral region? Between your gluteal region. So the sacral region is the bottom of your vertebral column, so it would be occipital. There's the occipital. What was your femoral region? Your leg. So D is the appendicular bone there. The scapula is part of the pectoral girdle. Therefore, it is axial, appendicular, bony, or cartilaginous. I actually have heard those in other classes, but not in anatomy. So we have, which choice? It's part of the limbs, so it would be appendicular. So this is how I'm going to test you. So we're going to start by looking at the cranial bones, and you'll be able to tell me which bones are in the cranium, which bones are facial. You will be able to tell me which bones are paired, which bones are not paired. What do I mean by this? Well, we have two occipital bones over here. Those would be paired bones. You will be able to identify which landmarks are on which bones, and you'll be able to spot ID bones in the lab. I'm going to give you the functions of the landmark because in my mind I have to tell you why the heck do you have to learn this thing, but we're not worrying about the functions yet. So, the skull. The skull has 22 bones, more or less, and they're split into two categories. So, we have our skull right here, and I can actually pull this part off. Look how easy it is. You do not belong there either. And I'm never going to put this back together. These bones surround your cranial cavity. They are the temporal bone in pink, the parietal bone in green, the frontal bone in blue, the occipital bone in lilac, the sphenoid bone, it's actually a really awesome looking bone, I can't wait to pull this out, in yellow, and the ethmoid bone in white. So why are these called cranial bones? Well, they surround your cranium. Took one of the green bones off. What region was that? That's right, it's the parietal region. Your brain would be right in here. So part of the brain would be bound by the temporal bone, part of it by the occipital bone. And if I twist it in here, I can see the yellow sphenoid bone, and then this little tiny shaft right there. That little itty-bitty part. And unfortunately with this skull, it's attached to the frontal bone and not the sphenoid bone. But this little white part that's in there, that's the ethmoid bone. So I look here, the ethmoid bone is this big bone. Well, only the very top part right here is actually in the cranial cavity. But because, ta-da, you can now see the hole in the frontal bone. I guess you could look that way. See the hole in the frontal bone. Because this part right here is bordering on the cranial cavity, it is a cranial bone. So again, the cranial bones are the frontal, the sphenoid, the temporal, the occipital, the parietal, and the cool little ethmoid bone. So the cranial bones are the bones that are making up the cranial cavity. So this is the parietal right here. This is the frontal. This is the temporal. This is the occipital. This right here is the sphenoid. So here it's purple in that one. And this right here is the ethmoid bone. So they touch the brain. The remaining bones do not touch the brain. And they are the mandible, the maxilla, the zygomatic bone, the nasal bone, the lacrimal bone, and these little bones inside your jaw, or inside your nasal cavity. So let us look at. So these bones generally do not touch the brain. So they are called facial bones. You would have this bone inside your nose making part of the septum called the vomer. you have the nasal bones here. If I turn it a little bit, I have the lacrimal bones there. I have the zygomatic bones here. This is the maxilla. Your lower jaw is the mandible, and if I turn it this way, I can actually see the inferior nasal conchoid bone. Let's see if I could get that closer to the camera without blurring it. Inferior nasal conchoid bone and the palatine bone, which makes up part of your palate. So if I hold it this way, there's your palatine bone, then the inferior nasal concha is hiding in there. These are all considered facial bones because they make up your face. So the cranial bones are the ones that make up your face. So I labeled that same skull here. So frontal, parietal, occipital, ethmoid, sphenoid, and the temporal bone. So they're named for the regions. And they make up the cranial cavity. Whereas the facial bones, oops, there's 8 of them. And 2 of them are paired, the rest are not paired. The only paired ones are the parietal bone and the temporal bone. So paired means there's 2 of them. So if I go back over here, I have 1 temporal bone there, 1 temporal bone there, there's 2 of them. I have 1 of my parietal bones here, and I took the other parietal bone off. They're the only paired ones. There is only 1 little ethmoid, 1 frontal, 1 sphenoid, and 1 occipital. So on the test, you need to tell me which ones are paired, which ones are not paired. So if we look at a rotating skull, there's 2 parietal bones, 1 frontal. The red is the ethmoid, the hot pink is the sphenoid, and the brown are the temporal. So those are the cranial, and only 2 of them are paired, the rest are not. The facial bones actually have the opposite pattern. Only 2 of them are unpaired. Only the mandible and the vomer are unpaired. So here are 2 buddies. We have the mandible right here. This is the vomer. It would be in the nasal cavity. All the rest of these bones are paired. We have 2 zygomatics, 1, 2, 2 nasal, ena, dio, 2 lacrimals, each knee, 2 inferior nasal concha, so inside the nasal cavity, 1, 2, 2 maxillary, under, and lastly, 2 palatine bones. I've forgotten which language I did not count to 2 in. So that is where we're going to stop. So far we've done what are cranial bones, what are facial bones, what is part of the axial skeleton, what's the appendicular skeleton, which is paired, which is not paired. I'm then in the next part going to go over all the landmarks. Usually I go a lot faster through this, but since you guys don't have skulls to play with at home that are anatomically correct, I thought I'd go slowly through this. So thank you. Have a good day.